Alexander's mom is right. Some days really are horrible, no good, very bad days. In fact, some years are like that, like this one. This year has undoubtedly been a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad year. But Alexander's mom says those things happen all too frequently. Life is full of pain and suffering and difficulty, and there's no imaginary good place in Australia to run to. But the question I have is why? And what do we do about it? How do we avoid that pain and suffering and difficulty? And how can we live with it? The ancient Hebrew people who wrote Psalm 6 and used it in their worship services, as we do today, they understood Alexander's problem. They had 2020 problems for centuries. We are certainly not alone here. The chosen people of God had terrible, horrible, no good, very bad times throughout their history. It began, of course, with Adam and Eve. They had a good place to live, and then they had the great fall by eating from the tree of knowledge, and they were punished with labor and pain and suffering. And then the Israelites had to suffer years and years when they were sent to Egypt and they were slaves and had to build the pyramids. And when they did manage to escape, they had to wander for 40 years in the desert and fight off giants in their new land. And when they did finally get to build their new land and have a beautiful city of Jerusalem, within a few years, the Babylonians came along and tore it all down, burned the temple to the ground, and carted them off as slaves again. And then the Greeks occupied their land, and then the Romans occupied their land, and finally, in the year 70, they had to all flee their land all over the world, and they ended up in many parts of the world and persecuted wherever they were. And then, of course, there was the Holocaust with millions killed, right up to today, when last week rioters in the Capitol were wearing sweatshirts that said Camp Auschwitz. The chosen people of God have known about terrible, awful, no good, very bad days for a long time. That's why Psalm 6 and many psalms like that are psalms of lament. They're all through the Bible. They are essentially complaints to God about the pain and suffering that we all have to endure. The people writing this song sound a lot like us today, sound a lot like Alexander. They had good reasons for their complaints. They even sound like me too often during this time over the last year. How long is this going to last, O God? I'm worn out from all my groanings. They say that in the psalm, and so do I. And then there's George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Eric Garner and Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin and so many innocent men killed by racism in this country. And then there are millions of refugees who've been forced to flee Syria and Afghanistan and Guatemala and so many war-torn and violence-prone places and stuffed into terrible refugee camps where there's no sewage and not little food. And of course, there are the 1,930,316 people who have died this year from COVID as of today. And then last week, the unthinkable. Our own citizens attacked the capital of our country trying to overturn a free and fair election. These are terrible, difficult times. And then it's true in our own personal life. Things go horribly wrong. We can lose our jobs. We can be forced from our homes. We are driven into depression or to unbearable loneliness, stuck at home. Cancer, diabetes, and other illnesses strike unexpectedly. Well, I have my own story to tell about that. 3 years ago, I was going along just fine, enjoying my life, when I felt in my neck a swollen lymph gland, and it just didn't seem to get better. And it was soon diagnosed as metastasized throat cancer. I was treated with surgery and chemotherapy and a whole month of daily radiation to my neck. And I'm here to tell you that the treatment for neck cancer is a really terrible, horrible, no good, very bad thing. I had to eat through a feeding tube for almost 5 months. I had intense pain as I tried to swallow. During those 6 months, all I could do was just lie on the couch. And lying there, doing nothing, I got really, really depressed. Not unlike many of us today sitting at home. I even had trouble getting out of bed in the morning because there didn't seem to be any reason to get out of bed. Several times during that period, I really thought about just not wanting to live anymore. And for those of you who know me, that's definitely not my personality. I'm usually positive and happy, but not in the middle of this treatment. I can identify with the psalmist. There were many days when I got so angry at God for allowing this to happen to me. I had never smoked a cigarette in my life, which is the usual cause of throat cancer, so why me? I really started to give up on God. And I'm sure most of you recognize that feeling from terrible times in your life. But that point of despair, that point when all hope seems lost, that is where our faith kicks in. We are not going to give up on God. Christian faith recognizes that life has so much pain and suffering, but it's not caused by God. Alexander's mom has it right. Some days are just like that. In our world, terrible, horrible, no good things just happen. But Christian faith deals uniquely and explains uniquely the way our God understands suffering. It helps us to deal with it. Because, you see, in our faith, God in Jesus experienced our suffering God's self. God knows pain and agony and abandonment and even death. I can't even imagine anything more terrible and horrible than being nailed to a cross unjustly for no good reason. But that terrible, horrible thing was not the end of the story. They buried Jesus. They thought their hope had died. It was the worst of terrible, horrible, no good days. And they almost gave up on God the way I do, many of us do in the worst moments. But those women among Jesus' followers, they did not give up. They went to the tomb on that Sunday morning, and when they got there, Jesus was no longer there. Like the chosen people, throughout all that suffering and pain and tragedy, God's plan was different. God did not want to leave them in that horrible despair. God is not defeated by the pain and suffering and evil that happens in our world. And the psalmist in Psalm 6 and all Psalms of Lament recognizes this. Toward the end of the psalm, after all that complaining to God, he finally recognizes God's loving presence. He says at the end of the song, "Away with me, all that are evil. For the Lord has heard my weeping. The Lord has heard my cry of mercy, and the Lord accepts my prayer. God hears when we are in pain, and God understands when we are here in pain. And the psalmist says, all of my enemies, all the troubles of the world will be put to shame, and they will turn back, and suddenly God's presence and love will be known. Paul insists the same thing in the Romans passage we heard earlier. He says, after listing all of those troubles, he says, nothing, absolutely nothing can separate us from the love of God. The most terrible, horrible, no good, very bad things that can happen in our world, they do not defeat God. They do not defeat us. Our faith announces that God is not dead. God is not here causing pain and suffering. God is here in the pain and suffering. And God is raised from that. And God raises us above it too. So as we begin a new year, let us remember that a few weeks ago was Christmas. Christ is born. Hope is born anew. As we go through our lives, like Alexander went through his day, pain and suffering, they will happen. But his mom is right. We will have many terrible, horrible, no good, very bad days. They happen. And there is no escaping to Australia. We can and we should complain to God as the psalmist does. We can complain bitterly, but under that complaint, just as the psalmist expects at the end of that psalm, we know, we are absolutely sure that God is always with us and God will overcome. I know I'm here today getting back to my old self. I'm cancer-free after 3 years. And despite 2020, I'm enjoying life. As the psalmist declares, my enemy cancer was defeated and put to shame. And like that, the chosen people of God were slaves in Egypt and Babylon and were killed in the Holocaust, but their enemies were put to shame and they survived and thrived. God promises us, my friends, God promises that we will always be loved with steadfast love. We are assured, absolutely assured, that we will always find hope and joy and promise, no matter how terrible, horrible, no good, and very bad things get. The Almighty, everlasting God has been our help through ages past. God walks beside us through all things, and God will always be our hope for years to come.